Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're focusing on a really pivotal couple of decades, 1947 right through to 1967.
Yeah, a massive period of change.
Absolutely. You've got the world sort of recalibrating after the war, and smack in the middle of that, the British Empire is fundamentally rethinking its global position. We want to dig into those key shifts, the big events, the policy changes that defined Britain's journey then.
Exactly. And we've got some great source material to help us unpack this. We'll be looking at texts covering British colonial policy, how they administered things, their dealings with Iran, that famous Winds of Change speech,
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
the whole Suez Crisis debacle, and just the general international relations landscape.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to really pull out the most significant changes. What were the driving forces, the factors that led to such a dramatic transformation of the empire in, well, just 20 years?
It's about getting a clear, concise understanding of this really crucial era.
Right. Okay, let's dive in. Starting right after World War II, um, Britain's involvement in Iran seems like a key starting point.
It really is. And you can't understand the 50s without looking back a bit. Our sources remind us about that joint British and Soviet invasion of Iran back in 41.
Because the Iranian leader was seen as pro-Nazi?
That was the justification, yeah. And this sets the scene for Britain's deep-seated interest in Iranian oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company set up way back in 1908, Britain holding over half the shares.
51%, wasn't it?
Exactly. Hugely important, especially for the Royal Navy, fueling the fleet.
So oil was absolutely critical, strategic, and that leads us straight into the big oil dispute in the 1950s. Iran clearly felt they weren't getting a fair deal.
That's the core of it. From the Iranian perspective, detailed in the sources, they felt exploited. Britain took, what, 80% of the profit?
80%, wow.
Yeah. And accusations flew about Britain, hiding the real profit figures. So Iran felt it wasn't getting its fair share of its own resources. Plus, you had growing competition internationally, like the American oil companies getting big in Saudi Arabia.
So a real feeling of imbalance, resentment building up. And then, in 1952, the Iranian PM nationalizes the oil industry. Big move. What happened next?
Well, Britain reacted strongly, tried to cripple Iran economically, basically.
Yeah.
Banning international tankers from touching Iranian oil.
An embargo, effectively.
Pretty much. A major standoff. And it really highlights that classic tension, doesn't it? Old colonial power trying to keep control of resources versus a nation wanting sovereignty.
But it didn't end with just economic pressure, did it? The sources mention a U.S.-led coup that actually overthrew the prime minister.
Yeah, that was the decisive and pretty controversial intervention. After the coup, new leadership in Iran, the oil company got renamed.
Right.
And the whole setup changed. Britain didn't have sole dominance anymore. The rights were shared outshell American companies alongside the original British one.
Right, abandoning the empire.
Yeah. But then within the colonies themselves, ministers were apparently quite suspicious. Like, okay, you're saying this, but what does it mean? Are you really committed to independence?
So, a lot of uncertainty and maybe distrust. But it wasn't just about acknowledging nationalism, was it? There was a pragmatic side, too, related to the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely. That's the other layer, fear of communism. The thinking seems to have been, look, independence is coming. We need to manage this transition so these new countries don't fall into the Soviet camp.
So guide them towards independence within a Western framework.
Exactly. A strategic calculation alongside the acknowledgement of national feeling.
Okay, now let's shift to another huge event, the Suez Crisis in 1956. Our sources call it embarrassing and disastrous. Pretty strong words.
And accurate, I think. It was a massive blow geopolitically, economically, symbolically, a real watershed moment showing Britain's declining power.
To get the context, Britain had been involved in Egypt and the canal for ages, right? Since the 1870s.
Yeah, bought a big stake in the Canal Company back in 1875. It was the lifeline to India, the jewel in the imperial crown. Absolutely vital route.
And even when Egypt got independence in the 20s, Britain kept troops there.
They did, officially to protect foreign investments and ensure the canal's security, which basically meant ensuring their shipping route was safe.
Right. Then comes Colonel Nasser in Egypt, 1952, and he nationalizes the Suez Canal, takes it from the Anglo-French Company, and puts it under Egyptian state control.
A hugely bold move. He did offer compensation to the shareholders, but Britain and France, who jointly ran the company, were outraged.
I remember reading the British PM, Eden, actually compared Nasser to Hitler.
Yeah.
Shows the level of animosity.
It really does. It shows how threatened they felt. And this led to that, well, Secret plan. Britain, France, and Israel conspiring to invade and seize the canal back.
Which backfired spectacularly.
Utterly. The U.S. condemned it forcefully. They were furious they hadn't been consulted properly and worried about Soviet influence growing. Egypt responded by sinking ships and blocking the canal entirely.
It's total mess. And the fallout.
Eden had to resign. Humiliating. The UN stepped in to sort out a ceasefire. Britain just looked weak, isolated, acting like an old imperial power in a world that had moved on.
So Suez really exposed that diminished standing on the world stage.
Unquestionably. It was a clear public demonstration that Britain couldn't just impose its will anymore, especially not against U.S. wishes, a major marker of imperial decline.
So with decolonization accelerating and crises like Iran and Suez happening, the whole international relations picture was changing rapidly during these 2 decades.
Dramatically. The sources underline this erosion of British power after the war. And by the 50s, you clearly have 2 superpowers dominating, the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
And Britain's economic vulnerability played into this, didn't it? Dependence on American money through the Marshall Plan.
Hugely important. Britain received about 26% of all Marshall Plan aid. That kind of economic reliance inevitably gives the donor, the U.S., significant leverage over your foreign policy.
Did the sources give specific examples of the U.S. dictating policy?
Not direct dictation necessarily, but it creates an environment where you have to, well, consider the American position very carefully. You can't afford to alienate your main financial backer.
Makes sense. And meanwhile, Europe was starting to coalesce as a power bloc.
Exactly. You see the formation of the European Economic Community, the EEC, in 1958, France, Germany, others, creating a free trade area, the precursor to the EU.
And Britain initially stayed out, tried to set up its own thing.
Yeah, Britain tried to join the EEC but was unsuccessful at first. De Gaulle famously said non. So they formed a rival group, EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, in 1960. It kind of shows Britain grappling with its place in this new European order.
Trying to find its role between the U.S., the Commonwealth, and this rising Europe.
Precisely. And of course, as the sources mention, Britain did eventually join the EEC in 1973, which makes sense looking back at these trends. Add to that the US dollar becoming the world's reserve currency after Bretton Woods. American influence was just growing massively on all fronts.
And the Commonwealth itself was changing shape too, wasn't it? It wasn't just the white dominions anymore.
Not at all. It was evolving rapidly as former colonies gained independence. India joined. Palestine issue was complex, but many new nations came in, though interestingly, Burma chose not to join, showing it wasn't automatic.
Right. Countries making their own choices.
Yeah. So all these threads, the rise of superpowers, economic shifts, European integration, the changing Commonwealth, they all weave together to show Britain's influence waning and new power centers emerging.
So pulling it all together from this deep dive, 1947 to 67 was just fundamentally transformative for Britain and its empire. It wasn't one single thing, but this confluence of factors.
Definitely. Rising nationalism in the colonies was maybe the underlying tide.
Right. Plus serious economic pressures back home.
And then the massive geopolitical shifts, the U.S. and Soviet Union stepping up. And those key events we talked about, like Suez, acting as real catalysts, or maybe exposing realities that were already there.
What really stands out from the sources, I think, is that tension. The contrast between that lingering pro-empire feeling in parts of Britain and the unstoppable drive for independence abroad.
Yeah, and how Suez just brutally revealed Britain's changed circumstances, almost like the emperor suddenly had no clothes on the world stage.
And that complex position Britain found itself in, needing U.S. support economically, but trying to carve out its own path politically in this new world order.
A very tricky balancing act.
It really gives you pause for thought.
Yeah.
When you consider how quickly and profoundly things changed in just those 20 years, it makes you wonder, what are the lasting legacies of that whole period? The colonial policies, the way decolonization happened, that still echo and shape our world today?
That's the big question, isn't it? How those historical threads continue to influence the present. Definitely something to reflect on.